Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Now, I was on the fence about The Mandalorian. The first episode was muted and did a good job at hiding just what kind of show The Mandalorian would be. The second episode found its stride and direction, but it wasn't until near the end of the third episode when a giant Mandalorian in full battle armor voiced by none other than showrunner Jon Favreau flew in on a jetpack wielding a ginormous Gatling blaster that I felt truly excited for the show. I even shed a tear for a second when I realized that the Mandalorians, who just earlier almost fought each other to the death for a few Beskar plates, were still the unified and honorable warriors we all grew up loving. While the Mandalorians took a pretty big hit during the Great Purge, it seems like we won't be returning to that very dark moment in Mandalorian history where these proud warriors actually became pacifists. Mandalorians are supposed to love fighting. They're supposed to be toxic, red meat-eating regressives that are the furthest thing from being woke. And it would truly be refreshing for Disney to realize that this is exactly what they've been missing since the beginning. So yeah, more jetpacks, ridiculously large guns, and face-kicking, please. But immediately after watching this really awesome battle and being reassured that no matter what happens, Mandos stick together, the cynical part of my brain that will never seem to shut down started asking questions like, well, is it a good idea to fly into combat on a jetpack? Now, we've done a ton of videos about the Mandalorians, and they're all in this playlist up here in the top right corner. And in most of these videos, I usually go back into the origins of the Mandalorians and their ancient history to kind of understand why they do what they do. The Mandalorians throughout their history freely roamed from one system to another, genociding lesser species and sending Republic forces running. They were pretty much unstoppable until they ran into Jedi. The first time the Mandalorians ran into the Jedi, they were stunned by these magical warriors who could anticipate their movements and deflect projectiles with energy swords. While more rational factions would have just given up to these magically delicious individuals, the Mandalorians, being the crazy bastards that they were, saw the Jedi as a worthy opponent. A lot of people look at the Mandalorians' love for battle and warfare and just assume that they're brutish, simple-minded, and unimaginative warriors. But that couldn't be further from the truth. While the Mandalorians kind of had a code of honor, they were still really pragmatic people who were willing to do whatever it took to win. And so the Mandalorians started modifying their equipment so they could get an advantage over the Jedi. Hidden zip lines and darts in the van braces could catch a Jedi by surprise. A flamethrower or a slug thrower was difficult for a Jedi to block and parry. And most importantly, you had a jetpack, which could increase your maneuverability and speed. Because Jedi were essentially melee combatants, their entire strategy revolved around staying alive long enough to get within lightsaber range. With their force-enhanced jumps and runs, it was almost impossible for a Mandalorian warrior on foot to keep that crucial spacing between them and a Jedi fighter. With a jetpack on their backs, the Mandalorians could easily create separation or even escape a battle if necessary. Now, there are all sorts of different types of jetpacks, but most of them used an engine for propulsion, and that engine was fueled by jet fuel mixed with oxygen. This means that these jetpacks don't really work in space or in places with very thin atmosphere. Although it seems like there were other variants of the jetpacks that could propel individuals into space, but these might be running on a gas propulsion system or something else. Either way, these jetpacks were essentially large barrels of fuel that soldiers would strap onto their backs and fly into combat with. Very dangerous. The jetpack had a complicated gyro stabilizer counterbalance system which allowed for smooth and reliable flight. These packs were pretty heavy at 30 kilos or 66 pounds, and they usually only had enough fuel for around 20 bursts. Both the Grand Army of the Republic and the Imperial military had their own special units of jetpacker troops, but their deployment was usually limited. For one, these packs were quite expensive and, as mentioned, added a significant amount of weight to the user. While the clones and Mandalorians were all pretty well trained and above average when it came to strength and conditioning, the Empire, especially in its latter years, were basically just accepting anyone into their ranks, so, the quality of these troopers were usually pretty suspect. There would need to be special physical requirements for a person to even be able to carry this heavy 60-pound fuel tank on their back into combat, and that's on top of all the weight a soldier is already carrying. This includes a helmet, armor, small arms, ammunition, explosives, comms, and survival equipment. And even for a tough Mandalorian who's been trained from a very young age to carry combat loads for extended periods of time, this would have been very difficult. Also, a full suit of Beskar plate armor is ridiculously heavy. A quick look at our own military history, whether it be the Union heavy dragoons versus half-naked Comanche warriors, or the plate-armored European knights versus Mongol horse archers, speed and maneuverability is equally as important, if not more important, than armor and firepower on any battlefield. But while a jetpack combined with Beskar can be very, very heavy, the jetpack also substantially increases the Mandalorian's mobility. This can be extremely useful and not just against the Jedi. Having the ability to fly, especially in a vertical environment like a forest or an urban area, can give your troops a significant tactical advantage in the high ground. It can also allow Mandalorian to hide and position themselves in places your enemy would never expect you, like in a bombed-out building with no stairs or lifts. And more importantly, such maneuvers to high ground can be performed at great speed. There's no need to use a grappling hook or some other device. There's no tedious climbing at all, one can just fly straight up. By using the verticality of an environment, a mobile force of jetpack troopers can quickly envelop or flank an enemy force. Now, it should be noted that when you place yourself on the high ground, especially in an exposed position like, say, on a tree or a bell tower, it also puts you at the mercy of enemy fire, because if you can see the enemy, they can probably see you, especially after you've fired off your first shot. This is why commanders usually never deploy troops in trees or other exposed high ground areas. And if they do deploy units on high ground, they usually are there for observation or overwatch purposes and need clearance before firing. Part of the problem with deploying in such exposed areas is how difficult it usually is to withdraw from such locations, especially while under fire. But again, the advantage of having a jetpack is you don't have to climb down, you can just fly away. Another great advantage for the device, especially if you're, say, a sniper and operating alone and don't want to get trapped after taking a shot. But then again, jetpacks are not the safest things in the world. They don't really have a backup mechanism, and if they're not well maintained or if the flyer is not very disciplined, you can encounter some pretty devastating consequences. Rebel officer Bren Derlin once remarked, "A lot of younger soldiers thought we ought to be zipping around the battlefield on jetpacks, but one direct hit and you're grounded, maybe forever." What Derlin is saying is true. Whether it's Imperials or clones, and to some extent Mandalorians, heavy casualties can be expected from your jetpack-wearing troopers. But there are ways to limit your casualties, especially when you look at how you deploy these troopers into battle. A common mistake we see in Star Wars is that jetpack troopers oftentimes will hover around in the air and start firing at the enemy. It might look cool, but ask anyone with a trained eye and they'll tell you that's some crazy John Wayne nonsense that only some untrained fool would do. First, if you are flying around in the air, you are completely exposed. Again, if you can see them, they can see you. And because you're not a Jedi, but just some grunts with a jetpack, your best chance of survival is not using your thrusters to dodge blaster bolts, but some good old-fashioned cover. Second, while it's kind of hard to shoot something flying around because of the lack of reference points in the sky to help gauge distance, it's also really hard to get a stable firing platform when you're flying in the air. Recoil is also difficult enough to manage when you're on the ground, and it's especially difficult when you're firing a Gatling gun, obviously designed for a vehicle, from the hip. And without any way to ground yourself, that recoil is going to be especially nasty because you are basically just hovering in the air. And as Officer Derlin mentioned, all it takes is one direct hit and you're done. A non-lethal shot when you're floating at 100 feet in the air wearing over 100 pounds of Duraplast, Durasteel, and explosive fuel will most likely be lethal if you lose flight and hit the ground. And if you take a look at this heroic charge by the Mandalorians in the last episode, it is kind of stupid. It's very epic, but stupid. They start off the attack nicely with a well-placed rocket, which takes out an enemy sniper position, but then they slowly float to the ground within arm's reach of the enemy combatants and just start shooting people at point-blank range. Now, I understand a few of them probably have some Beskar on them, so they really can't die all that easily, but why would they just let their tactical advantage go away so quickly? I'm beginning to suspect that there's a reason why this specific faction of Mandalorians are hiding underground. They clearly all inhaled way too much jetpack fume on their way over and totally forgot about using cover. Jetpacks are great for getting into the battle, maybe overcoming some kind of vertical obstacle, and moving from cover to cover quickly. But aside from that, there's really not much more you should be doing with a jetpack. But by the time Jetpack Gatling Bro lands, the enemy's already in full retreat. In the Mandalorians' defense, despite their completely idiotic strategy, the shock of seeing heavily armored Mandalorians descending from the heavens was enough to break the enemy's spirits. But then again, they were only fighting a bunch of poorly disciplined thugs and bounty hunters. Try that against an emotionless droid army, and I'm pretty sure you'll have a lot of jetpack Mandalorian craters all across the battlefield. One last thing, judging by how jetpacks are supposed to work, Gatling Gun Mandalorian probably didn't make it back to the ground before running out of fuel. So obviously there are a lot of limitations to what a jetpack can do, but if you operate within those limitations, you have a very useful piece of technology that can definitely give you the upper hand in any kind of battle. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below. Thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.